Welcome to the Business Transformation Pitch. I am Greg, the CX goalkeeper, bringing you conversations where transformation, leadership, and customer experience meet to create real impact. Did you know 80% of regular listeners haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy the show, support us by hitting the subscribe button. I promise we will keep raising the bar with the guests, ideas, and strategies that really matter to you. Because in business, just like in football, this conversation could be the game changer. I am Greg's AI-based assistant. In this episode, Greg had the pleasure of hosting Marbue Brown, where they discussed about the fascinating topic of customer obsession. Marbue shared incredible insights into how businesses can benefit by truly betting on their customers, differentiating between being customer-focused and customer-obsessed. They explored the customer obsession, Continuum, and discussed real use cases where companies have successfully moved up this continuum. It was a truly engaging conversation. Enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business Transformation Pitch with the CX Goalkeeper. I am Greg, and I'm super thrilled to have Marbue Brown together with me because I was able or allowed to discuss on his podcast, Be Customer-Led, and Marbue is really driving. It's a total leaders and shares a lot of interesting insights in customer experience, business transformation, and it was really time to have Marbue on the podcast. As usual, we wanted first to introduce our guest, and therefore let's introduce our top player today, Marbue Brown. Marbue, could you please describe your top career moment like scoring a goal in a big match?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Greg. I'm really glad to be on the program with you. And I just look forward to having an amazing discussion with you. Forgive me when I think of top career moments, there's actually three moments that come to mind. I want to share what they are. So I think of the day that I joined JP Morgan Chase, back in 2017. And the company made a press release when I joined them that day. And the next thing I knew was there were all these stories on all of these different media outlets talking about how Chase had poached an executive from Amazon. And I thought, wow, it just was out there. Next thing I knew, people were texting me, people were calling me. There was even a story the next day in Business Insider that said 10 things people need to know before European markets open. And Chase hiring me was number 3 on that list. So for me, that was a big career, a big career moment. And then, a couple of years later, there was a Wall Street Journal article entitled Jeff Bezos and Jamie Dimon, Best of Frenemies. And they referenced me in that article again. And I thought, okay, wow, this is pretty cool, right? But coming to like results, okay, and let me take a career moment that deals with results. Look, when I joined Chase, one of the things we did was we put together a multi-year goal for what we wanted to achieve for customer experience. And we were making steady progress towards that goal. And we had hit our highest ever, results in February of 2020. And then you know what happened after that? The pandemic hit. And within a couple of months, we lost a lot of the ground that we gained. But the good news is that by September of that year, we had made up that ground. We had made it to the goal that we had, had set out to do. And by October, we had surpassed that goal. And to me, that was a big moment because we did that even in the middle of the pandemic. And so, those are 3 moments that just stand out for me when I think of, career moments.
That's incredible. But now I need to say it's already 3-0 for Marbue. And then we can finish here. Thank you very much. It was everything for today. No, joke aside, as you are here, we want to continue discussing you, and you can keep scoring goals in this episode. How do you win in your current role?
Well, look, in my current role, I'm an advisor, I'm a coach, I'm a speaker, and I win when I get companies to buy into the notion that you never lose when you bet on the customer, right? You never lose when you bet on the customer. And sometimes what companies do is they put in place um, policies that they're designed to kind of like protect the bottom line. Okay. And when I say you don't lose by, betting on the customer, I'm not saying that, the company gives away the store, right? What I am saying is that sometimes you have to make decisions where you're not right at that moment able to connect the dots to the financial benefit to the company. But companies never lose when they make that bet. And again, I'm not saying give away the store, because if you give away the store, that would be a charity. It won't be a business, right? But on the other hand, sometimes, companies go into this protect mode with their policies and whatnot, and they tend not to win when they do that. I think of an example. I just wrote it up, last week in a LinkedIn post where a widow went to use a power tool that her husband had bought just a few months earlier. The tool didn't work, so she reached out to the company. The tool was under warranty, or at least she thought it was, to try to get a replacement. And they said, well, your husband was the purchaser. The warranty applied to him. It doesn't extend to you. Now, clearly, that's a policy that wasn't betting on the customer, right? But they didn't win with that policy, because now they're going to get all this bad press, okay, which is going to be damaging to their reputation, right? And it's probably going to deter people from buying products from them. Didn't win by that policy, right? And the reason they didn't win is because they didn't bet on the customer. Now, on the other hand, if they tried to do some ROI calculation to be 100% sure of how this was going to connect the dots back to their financial benefit, if in fact they replace that item for this widow, they might not be able to do that ROI analysis. But I guarantee you, if they had done the reverse and replaced that, the positive press that they would be getting from this, it would pay for itself, right? And so I win when I get businesses to buy into that notion that they should bet on the customer, right? But let me add one more thing. I also win when I get businesses to buy into the notion of working backwards, prioritizing use cases in their AI um, investments and their AI deployments versus prioritizing the technology, right? There are a lot of use cases where CX leaders have been beating their heads against the wall, trying to solve these problems that have been perennial problems, which AI has now kind of enabled them to crack the code. And if they're focusing on those problems um, in their AI investments and deployments, they're going to win. But if they're prioritizing the new shiny object, which is AI, they might wind up in the category of these folks who are doing deployments and not getting any ROI back. So that's another place I win. And if it comes up later on, we can talk more about what are some of those perennially intractable problems. But those are a couple of ways that I win, in my current role.
Thank you very much. Now we know you a bit better, and we already kick off the discussion because you already shared several great examples to understand the main topic. Today we are going to discuss about customer obsessions. You are a vivid supporter of customer obsessions, and what's its differentiating a company that is customer focused or customer centric from a company that is really customer obsessed?
Well, it comes back to this idea that I talked about early on, where companies that are customer obsessed, they start with the customer and they work backwards, right? Now, and companies that are in some of the other spaces, they might prioritize the customer, but they might work backwards from a product, or they might work backwards from profits, right? So the customer is an important part of what they're doing, but they don't obsess over the customer, right? When I think, so I worked for Amazon, who actually, coined the term customer obsession. Let me tell you a question that I almost never heard asked at Amazon, and that is, what is the competition doing, right? And it's because we weren't focused on what the competition was doing. We're focused on, if I work backwards from the customer, where am I going to land, right? And what am I going to do if I work backwards from the customer? And so that's a big difference between the companies that are customer obsessed and those that are customer centric or customer focused. In fact, I like to define customer obsession as, the company taking actions, making investments, adopting policies that are in the customer's favor, even when they cannot immediately connect the dots to the financial benefit. Because no company that has ever bet that way has lost. In fact, if the reverse is true, they always wind up with business results that far surpass their peers. They outperform their peers, you know, over and over. And so that's what customer obsession is.
Thank you very much for this incredible explanation, and really learning from the best, the companies that you mentioned. It's clear that it's difficult to compare with the competition if you are setting the new standards in the market. I know that you also speak about the customer obsession continuum. Could you please explain what it is in simple words that we can understand it?
Well, look, as I looked at companies that are customer obsessed versus their peers, I identified like 5 levels of how companies engage with their customers. So you have companies that are customer indifferent. You have companies that are customer aware. You have companies that are customer focused, customer centric, and customer obsessed, right? And there's a set of things that are, similar, in companies that fit these descriptions, right? So, for example, if you look at, companies that are customer obsessed, there is a surround sound, okay, within those companies about the fact that the customer is the priority. These are themes that are constantly communicated from the top of the company all the way through. Or if you take an organization within a company, it's themes that are communicated from the top of that organization all of the all of the way through. There are behaviors that are modeled by people who are in the top of the organization all the way through. Let me give an example of something. And I'm going to use a specific leader, Tashunda Brown Duckett. Okay. And she had a practice that she used to do called hashtag Thank You Thursday. Okay. And on hashtag Thank You Thursday, she would send out a note to the entire consumer bank, thanking people in the bank for something that they had done. Now that could be like an associate banker or a set of bankers in a specific branch. Now imagine if you're in that branch and you get an email that goes out to the whole entire organization sent out by the CEO that highlights your branch and what you did in that branch. Well, I mean, those people are walking on the moon, even though they haven't gone in a spaceship, right? But that is appreciation. Okay. Well, that started with the CEO. Then it went to the CEO's directs, who would also do their version of hashtag Thank You Thursday. And then there were other executives, the plus twos, who would do their version of hashtag Thank You Thursday. And so what you see this kind of behavior permeating the entire organization, right? Well, in companies that, may be customer focused or customer centric, you don't necessarily see these kinds of practices permeating the entire organization, right? So you might see some things scattered here and there, but you don't see that kind of, surround sound type of activity. Or, in a customer obsessed organization, when there's business reviews, what you see is you see, that voice of the customer things are an important part of those business reviews. There's actions that are assigned based on insights that have been raised. But then at some point in the next business review, there's follow-up as to whether those actions have actually, taken place or made any kind of difference. In other places, don't, like it might not even make the agenda, right? Or if it makes the agenda, it might be a check off and you never hear anything about it ever again, right? And so actually in my book, Blueprint for Customer Obsession, there's a whole section on the customer obsession continuum, and it describes for each one of these levels, right? What are the characteristics that defines each level of the customer obsession continuum, right? And I gave you the 5 categories a little bit earlier, so folks can dig into that, right? So.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And you shared with us incredible cultural example how to focus on customer obsession and what it really mean to define it, follow it, and living it and doing it every day. Is there a way to measure customer obsessions? You created the customer obsession barometer. How does it work?
Well, look, what we did with the customer obsession barometer, and one of the people working with me as part of the customer obsession advantage is Dr. John Hughes, and we put together the customer obsession barometer based on practices, 9 practices that are identified in Blueprint for Customer Obsession as practices that differentiate customer obsessed companies from some of their peers or from their peers, right? So, for example, one of those practices is giving customers what they want before they know they need it. That's a really interesting, little kind of example. But I think of, if you have an Apple Watch, and you use Apple CarPlay in your car. And you're wearing your watch and you're driving and you're getting to a place where you have to make a turn and the watch starts, beeping your hand. You never thought you were going to need your watch as something that would help you to navigate driving, but now you have that, right? That's giving customers something they want before they knew they even needed it, right? Or being able to do different kinds of health things on your watch. People didn't know that they needed that, but now they have those things, and it's like, oh, I can't live without that, right? So that's an example of giving customers what they want before they know they need it, or personalizing touch points with customers, right? So these are some of the kinds of things that or creating wow moments and connections with customers. So these are some of the practices that customer obsessed companies do. Okay. And what we did was we created an instrument where we can measure the performance of companies on these practices, right? And then using that, we've administered that instrument several times with, different kinds of industries and stuff like that. And what we learned is that the barometer really does create a demarcation between the top tier companies and the bottom tier companies. But I'll tell you something else we learned. We learned about a group of customers that we call obsessed customers. Okay, so we talk about customer obsession, but customer obsession creates obsessed customers. And these are customers who they don't just tell you that they're likely to recommend, but in fact, what we find is that these folks have recommended a business 5+ times in the last 12 months. And those customers also say that they absolutely will repurchase from that business in the next 12 months. Now, so these obsessed customers, and there's some more things we have about obsessed customers because they also have, certain patterns of behavior relative to social media and all of that sort of stuff. But we've wrapped all these things into the customer obsession barometer, and it really gives us, like some really good insights into where where companies actually stand on the customer obsession continuum. So now we have that in a very quantitative form as well.
Thank you very much. Usually ask that at the end, but I think it's now time to ask that where can we find your book, or where can the audience find your book?
Well, the book is available on Amazon. It's Blueprint for Customer Obsession, and frankly, it's available where books are sold. So it's available in all the usual places, Barnes and Noble, and on Apple and all of those kinds of things. So it's available both in paperback form as well as in electronic forms and whatnot. So. Yeah.
That's the real-time advertising. But I really suggest and recommend people to check the book and to really learn these interesting insights, these interesting tools that you can use and leverage. But now we're coming to the second half of this game. It's about real use cases, real stories. You shared already a lot of examples. Can you share a success story, an example of a company that really made progress moving through customer obsession?
Well, look, I would say I'm going to use Chase as a company that has moved up the customer obsession continuum, and let me tell you, Chase has done a lot of things well. Okay, but the thing that I would like to focus on is how Chase is focused on employee obsession, because employee obsession and customer obsession are inextricably linked, right? And that's one of the things that Chase has done really well. And let me give you an example. Employee listening. Okay. That's something that the company does really well, has gotten better at doing. And it's not just about the listening. Okay. Because part of it is capturing the feedback. Another part of it is actioning that feedback. And yet another part of it is circling back to let the employees know how their feedback made a difference. And at Chase, they do all of those things, right? Listen well. They have a whole system that, does ongoing feedback. So there's constantly feedback coming in from the branches into headquarters. That feedback is being processed, is being actioned. They're circling back and letting people know how that made a difference. Now, prior to the pandemic, we were on a frequency where we would summarize feedback on a monthly basis and actually action it on that basis. During the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic, we've pivoted to a system where we were doing that on a daily basis because there were actions that had to be taken, pretty much immediately, right? And if there was anything that was going on out there, we would hear about it extremely quickly in employee feedback. branch. The bank has almost 5,000 branches. They weren't all open at the time, but a decent amount of them were, and we were getting the feedback coming in constantly, turning it around. Actions were being taken, and so folks could actually see how their feedback was being actioned in real time, and that makes a huge difference. But besides um, the ongoing feedback, there's other ways that the company listens, like branch visits by senior executives, and I'm talking about all the way to the top of the consumer bank, where there's regular branch visits, and to some extent there's a priority on getting to branches that would normally seldom be visited, right? And listening to the folks, and learning from those folks, and then taking that feedback and actioning it. You might have even heard about the annual Jamie Dimon bus tour. That always gets written up. But besides what Jamie does, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. And those visits aren't just used for listening. They're also used for recognition, right? And that's another big part of what the company has done well in moving up that continuum. And again, besides the ongoing visits and all of those kinds of things, there's a whole week set aside that focuses on employee recognition and employee appreciation. So, forgive me if I went on there, but my basic point is this is concrete stuff, right? It really makes a big difference in terms of moving up that customer obsession continuum. And hey, there's lots more I can delve into there, but we'll leave that at that for now.
Let's plan that for the next episode that we are going to record together. I think for today we are
Okay.
coming to the end of this game, but as usual, at the end of the game we have some penalties. Our short question with short answer. Who is your role model in business?
Well, my role model in business, I choose Deshunda Brown Duckett. She is the CEO of TIAA, and she was the CEO of the consumer bank at Chase, when I joined. And I've had the privilege of working with a lot of great leaders. But when I take the combination of the most inspirational, the most visionary, and the most effective in producing results, all bundled up together, I picked T, and she is easily that in terms of a leader that I work with directly.
Thank you. What's your transformation superpower?
My transformation superpower is to take things that would normally be complex and to make them a little bit more simple so that they can be more relatable to the folks who need to utilize those as part of a transformation, right? And I may be stepping on another question here, but when I was at Microsoft, we put this together something called the MSAT improvement approach. And what we did with the MSAT improvement approach was we took um, Six Sigma principles, excuse me, that would normally be, sometimes people would think of them as almost onerous or something like that. But we put it into a simple kind of a set of tools that people could use to action feedback from the company's flagship customer feedback program. Because people used to flounder, didn't know what to do next, right? And we took that and we put it together into something called the MSAT improvement approach. And I was just reflecting on this the other day. This was back before we had Zoom and all this kind of stuff. And my colleague and I were talking about how we used to be on campus at 3 o'clock in the morning, doing workshops with like the business units in Asia and whatnot, and some of those folks went from being worst in their grouping to being best. winning country level awards and all of those kinds of things. And so that was, what I think of as the transformation superpower, where we took something and simplified it so it could be readily used.
What's the toughest challenge you have beaten in business?
Well, the toughest challenge is part of a collective effort. And what I just described was actually part of that collective effort. At Microsoft, when the quality and business excellence team was spun up, there had already been like three previous attempts at taking Six Sigma principles and embedding them into, problem solving practices in the business, right? But this was the one that worked. And the example I just gave you was part of how it worked, right? But I was part of a larger team that wasn't able to finally crack the code and get that embedded into the business. And so I think, since there were three previous attempts that didn't stick, I think that was, a pretty significant challenge to overcome.
What's your winning habit?
Winning habit is looking at things from different vantage points. You know, it's I think sometimes we can get stuck when we're trying to solve a problem if we can only see it from one perspective. And so this actually requires listening to other people's perspectives and whatnot, because when you see something from a just one vantage point, sometimes you don't see all the possibilities for how you can solve a problem. And there's actually a movie I always tell people about, and I used to make people on my team watch this movie. It's called Vantage Point. And it's an interesting movie about how a president is in another country, and he gets shot. Okay, and it shows you the vantage point of a reporter or somebody like that in the beginning of the movie. But much later on, it shows you the vantage point of the president. And here's the interesting thing. The vantage point of the president is in a hotel room watching what's going on outside. And he's complaining to his security detail that the guy who they put up there as his body double doesn't even look like him. Okay. But he's looking at it from a whole different vantage point. And of course, when you watch the movie at the beginning and you see what happens, you think, oh no. But then you realize, hey, wait a minute, that's not even the president who was up there. Right. And but it shows you the value of being able to see things from different vantage points. And I think that's pretty incredible, that if you can look at a problem from different vantage points, you can see possibilities for solutions that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
And now we're coming to the closing short, or the golden nugget. It's something that we discussed or something new to leave to the audience with.
Well, look, one of the things that I do in the book with the Customer Obsession Continuum is I have like some questions that people can use to jumpstart themselves, right? But I'm going to give people this one question, or actually two questions that they can use. One question is, does your company have any policy that is so customer friendly that it would make customers do a double take, or even make your employees do a double take when they implement that policy? And for people who shop at Costco, for example, they know that the Costco return policy is one of those policies that make people do a double take, right? So I'll just put that out there as an example. And then the flip side of that is, does your company have any policy that is objectionable? It's so objectionable that your employees want to distance themselves from that policy when they have to implement it, so that they don't even say, this is what we're doing. They say, this is what they're doing, right? So you got to ask yourself, is my answer to the first one yes, or is it no? Because if it's no, there's a good chance you're not at the top of the customer obsession continuum. And if your answer to the second one is yes, I do have objectionable policies, or at least one, then there's a good chance you're not at the top of the continuum. So that would be the nugget that I would leave with people.
The only thing that I can say at the end of this game is, Marbue, thank you very much. It was an amazing discussion. And please stay with me. To the audience, you will find the link to the book and all the social media links of Marbue in the show notes. Feel free to contact us, to contact me or Marbue for any question. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. It was an incredible discussion. A lot of goals scored by Marbue. It was a great game. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated being on the program.
That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word. It really helps. And remember, 80% of regular listeners haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoyed the show, the easiest way to support us is by hitting that subscribe button. I promise we will keep raising the bar with the guests, ideas, and strategies that matter most to you. Until next time, never forget, we are not in B2B or B2C, we are in H2H, human-to-human environment. Thank you.